In 1871, a 19-year-old cowboy sat on his horse at 3 in the morning, surrounded by 3,000 nervous longhorn cattle in the darkness. And he sang, not for entertainment, but because if he stopped singing, those cattle might stampede and kill everyone. If you watched part 1 of our cattle drive series, you know about the 1,000-mile journey, the stampedes, the river crossings, the brutal economics that created this migration of 27 million cattle between Texas and Kansas. But we didn't tell you the whole story, because the most remarkable thing about the cattle drive wasn't the cattle at all. It was the men who drove them. 1 in 4 cowboys was black. Another significant portion were Mexican or Native American. Many were teenagers, some as young as 12. They wore clothes designed for survival, not style. And when they finally reached the end of the trail with months of pay in their pockets, they walked into towns that were unlike anything else in America. This is part 2. And whether you've seen part 1 or not, by the end of this video, you'll know who the real cowboys were. Let's start with the fact that Hollywood spent a century trying to erase. Up to 25% of all cowboys were African American. That's not a guess. That's history. Between 1866 and 1886, approximately 35,000 men worked as cowboys on the great cattle drives. By the most conservative estimates, at least 5,000 were black. Some historians put that number even higher. And here's what makes this even more remarkable. Before the Civil War, African Americans were the majority of cowboys in Texas. The earliest evidence of black cattle herders in North America traces back to colonial South Carolina, where stock grazers from Senegal in West Africa, were specifically brought to the colony because of their unique skills with livestock. By the 1850s, with 1/3 of Texas's population enslaved, African Americans dominated the cattle industry. They were assigned the dangerous task of catching and tending wild cattle in the Gulf Coast brush country. They worked alongside Mexican vaqueros, learning techniques that would define cowboy culture for generations. Then came the Civil War, and after it, emancipation. Suddenly, being a cowboy became one of the few jobs open to black men who wanted real work, not serving as elevator operators or delivery boys. The cattle drives needed skilled hands, and former enslaved people had those skills. They knew horses, they knew cattle. They could rope and ride better than most white men who'd never worked livestock. And for a brief moment in American history, out on the trail, something unusual happened. Merit mattered more than race. Not everywhere, not always, not even most of the time in towns. But on the trail, when a stampede hit at midnight, when cattle were drowning in a river crossing, when Comanche raiders approached the herd, in those moments, a man's skin color mattered less than his skill with a rope and his courage under fire. One historian described it perfectly. Cowboys had to depend on one another. They couldn't stop in the middle of some crisis like a stampede or an attack by rustlers and sort out who's black and who's white. Famous names emerged. Bose Icard worked for the legendary Charles Goodnight on the Goodnight-loving trail. When Icard died, Goodnight wrote his epitaph, "Served with me 4 years on the Goodnight-loving trail, never shirked a duty or disobeyed an order, rode with me in many stampedes, participated in 3 engagements with Comanches. Splendid behavior." Nat Love became so famous in Deadwood, South Dakota, after winning a rodeo that he wrote a best-selling memoir. He described his fellow cowboys, black, white, Mexican, with admiration. "A braver, truer set of men never lived than these wild sons of the plains, whose home was in the saddle." Bill Pickett invented the rodeo technique of bulldogging, jumping from a horse onto a steer and wrestling it to the ground by biting its lip. He became the first black man inducted into the Rodeo Hall of Fame. But here's the reality Hollywood never showed you. When these men reached the Kansas cow towns at the end of the trail, the relative equality they'd experienced on the open range vanished. In Dodge City, in Abilene, in Wichita, they faced the same discrimination black Americans faced everywhere else in the 1870s. They were barred from certain restaurants, banned from certain hotels, segregated to specific areas of town, One incident in 1876 tells the story. A black cowboy walked into the Dodge House Hotel in Dodge City and asked for a room. The clerk told him no rooms were available. The cowboy knew it was a lie. But what could he do? On the trail, he'd been an equal. In town, he was just another black man in Jim Crow America. And yet, despite everything, they kept riding. Because out there on the prairie, for those few months each year, they felt something that was rare for black men in the 1870s. They felt free. Now, let's talk about the gear. Because every single piece of equipment a cowboy wore had a purpose. Start with the boots. Cowboy boots aren't a fashion statement. They're survival tools designed by people who spend 18 hours a day on horseback. The high heel? That's to keep your foot from sliding through the stirrup. If your foot slides through and you fall off the horse, you get dragged. And being dragged by a 1,000-pound horse across rocky terrain at 15 miles per hour is usually fatal. The pointed toe, which originally was slightly rounded and only became sharply pointed in the 1940s for Hollywood, makes it easier to slide your foot into the stirrup quickly. When you're mounting and dismounting dozens of times a day, that matters. The tall shaft protects your leg from stirrup chafing, horse bites, snake strikes, and barbed wire. And the smooth leather sole? That's intentional. It slips in and out of the stirrup easily, unlike rubber, which grabs and sticks. Then there are the spurs. Most people think spurs are cruel. They're not, when used correctly. Cowboys would dull the sharp points on their rowels before ever using them. Sharp rowels make a horse nervous. Dull ones provide a gentle rolling pressure that communicates clearly. Move forward, turn left, speed up, slow down. The larger the rowel, the gentler the spur. A big rowel with many points doesn't dig in as deeply as a small rowel with few points. Cowboys knew this. They valued their horses more than almost anything else in the world. The last thing they wanted was to hurt their working partner. Some cowboys even attached small metal pendants called jingle bobs to their spurs. These created a distinctive jingling sound when walking. It was partly for fun, partly for identity, and partly practical. The sound could help calm nervous cattle. Chaps, pronounced chaps, borrowed from the Spanish chaparreras, were leather leggings worn over pants. They protected against thorns, cactus, brush, rope burns, and saddle chafing. In the Northwest, where cowboys wore long chaps, spurs even had chap guards, small curved projections that kept the chaps from getting caught in the rowel. And that distinctive bandana, it wasn't a fashion accessory. Cowboys soaked it in water and tied it over their nose and mouth to filter the dust kicked up by 3,000 cattle. Without it, they'd cough up dirty phlegm for weeks after a drive. Every piece of gear had a reason. Every detail had been tested by men whose lives depended on getting it right. So what was a typical day actually like on the trail? It started early, very early. The cook, rising at 3 a.m, would shout across the camp, "Bacon in the pan, coffee in the pot," or "Roll out, daylight in the swamp." Cowboys would roll out of their bedrolls, nicknamed flea traps because that's exactly what they were, and stumble toward the chuck wagon. They'd grab tin cups of coffee so strong it could float a horseshoe, wolf down biscuits and beans, maybe some salt pork or bacon. Then they'd catch their horses for the day. Each cowboy had 3 horses in his string and would rotate them to keep them fresh. Catching a half-wild horse in pre-dawn darkness was its own adventure. By first light, the herd was moving, 15 miles a day, every day, for months. The point riders led at the front, the most prestigious position, given to the most experienced cowboys. The swing and flank riders kept the herd in formation on the sides, and the drag riders ate dust at the back, choking on it, tasting it in every meal. Lunch was eaten in the saddle, maybe some jerky, maybe a biscuit saved from breakfast. The herd never stopped moving during daylight. Around sundown, they'd bed down the cattle. The cook would have already driven ahead to set up camp. Dinner was beans. The cowboys called them whistleberries. Rice, biscuits, maybe fresh beef if they'd butchered a steer. Then came the most important part of the day, night watch. 2 cowboys at a time would circle the sleeping herd in opposite directions, riding for 2-hour shifts. And they'd sing. Methodist hymns worked well. sad ballads like Bury Me Not on the Lone Prairie. Songs about Jesse James were particularly good during thunderstorms. The way it worked was beautiful. One cowboy on one side of the herd would sing a verse. His partner on the opposite side would sing the next verse. Back and forth, trading verses through entire songs all night long. It wasn't about entertainment. It was survival. As long as the cattle could hear that familiar human voice, they didn't panic at the sounds of the prairie, the wolves, the coyotes, the rustling grass, the distant thunder. Some cowboys would rub chewing tobacco inside their eyelids during night watch. The burning sensation kept them from falling asleep in the saddle. Because if you stopped singing, even for a moment, 3,000 nervous longhorns might explode into a stampede that killed everyone. And when you weren't on night watch, you slept on the ground. No tent, no mattress, just a bedroll in the sky. Spiders crawled in your hair. Centipedes explored your ears. Rattlesnakes sometimes slithered under your blanket for warmth. You learned to shake out your boots every morning before putting them on. With only 4 to 5 hours of sleep split across night watch shifts, exhaustion was constant. But you did it anyway, because that was the job. Then, after 2 to 4 months of this, you finally reached the end of the trail. Abilene, Dodge City, Wichita, Ellsworth. And suddenly, everything changed. These weren't normal towns. They were temporary madhouses built specifically to separate cowboys from their money as quickly as possible. Abilene in 1870 had a population of maybe 300 permanent residents, but it had 40 saloons. Between every 2 saloons was a dance hall. Behind every barroom was a gambling layout. The Alamo Saloon, the grandest gambling establishment on Texas Street, had an orchestra that played morning, afternoon, and night. The streets were chaos, pianos tinkling in the dance halls, coarse laughter spilling from saloons, cowboys whooping and firing pistols in the air. Every man carried at least 1 gun. Most carried 2. Cowboys would arrive covered in months of trail dust, smelling like cattle and sweat and campfire smoke. The first thing they'd do? Visit a bathhouse, then a barbershop for a shave and haircut, then buy new clothes, and yes, strap on their guns again, because this was before lawmen like Tom Smith started enforcing gun restrictions. Then they'd hit Texas Street. The saloons had names like the Bull's Head, the Pearl, the Elkhorn. The gambling houses ran 24 hours. Faro, poker, Monte, any game you wanted. Professional gamblers in expensive clothes and gaudy jewelry sat with expressionless poker faces, waiting for drunk cowboys with full pockets. The dance halls charged 10 cents a dance. A cowboy who'd been on the trail for 3 months seeing nothing but other men and cattle would pay that gladly. The women who worked there, dance hall girls, got a cut of the drink sales. The more a cowboy danced, the more he drank. The more he drank, the more he spent. About a mile north of the tracks sat a colony of rambling frame structures, each with 10 to 15 rooms. These were the brothels where the soiled doves of the cattle trade catered to men who'd been celibate for months. For many cowboys, an entire season's wages, $100 to $150, could vanish in a week, sometimes less. The system was designed to extract money from free-spending Texans as efficiently as possible, and it worked brilliantly. One pioneer who lived in Abilene during the cattle trade described it. When the Texan connected with the cattle trade got too much tanglefoot aboard, he was extremely liable under the least provocation to use his navies. In fact, if their fancy told them to shoot, they did so in the air or at anything they saw. Dodge City was even wilder. The burial ground there was called Boot Hill because so many men died with their boots on. Front Street paralleled the railroad tracks, a line of saloons, gambling houses, and dance halls where the same coarse pleasures and grim tragedies played out night after night. The Long Branch Saloon became famous enough that it would later be immortalized in the television series Gunsmoke. For a time in 1884, Dodge City even had a bullfighting ring where Mexican bullfighters would perform with specially chosen longhorn bulls. But here's the truth that Hollywood never showed. Despite the guns, despite the legendary lawmen like Wild Bill Hickok and Wyatt Earp, Most violence in these towns wasn't from gunfights. It was from accidents, drunken brawls, knives, not pistols. The famous shootouts were rare. The real danger was getting too drunk, gambling away your wages, and finding yourself broke and stranded hundreds of miles from home with winter approaching. Some cowboys sold their horses to get home. Some got advances from their employers and rode the train back to Texas. Others rode back down the trail with the chuck wagon, broke and exhausted, ready to do it all again next year. Because that was the life they'd chosen. By the mid-1880s, it was ending. Railroads extended into Texas. Barbed wire fenced the open range. Kansas banned Texas cattle from crossing its borders. The economics that had created the cattle drive solved themselves. And the cowboys, most only worked the trail for a year or two. The wages were too low, $25 to $40 a month, to make it a career. The work was too brutal, the hours too long. Many moved into other industries. Some became ranch hands on the new privately owned spreads. African-American cowboys found fewer and fewer opportunities as the industry professionalized and racism reasserted itself. By 1890, black cowboys comprised only 3% of cowboys in Texas, down from being the majority just 30 years earlier. But decades later, when those men were old and were interviewed in the 1920s and 1930s, they remembered those years differently than you might expect. Not with bitterness, not with regret, with pride. One former cowboy said it best, "In my earliest boyhood days, the great ruling ambition was to become a cowboy." Another wrote, "To us wild cowboys of the range, used to the wild and unrestricted life of the boundless plains, the new order of things did not appeal. Many of us became disgusted and quit the wild life for the pursuits of our more civilized brother. They'd lived something that felt like freedom. They'd faced nature on its own terms and survived. They'd ridden alongside history, driving millions of cattle that would feed a growing nation. And for African-American cowboys especially, those years represented something even more profound. For a brief moment, out there on the trail, a black man could prove his worth not through servitude, but through skill. He could earn respect not through deference, but through courage. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even fair, especially in the trail towns. But it was more than most black men in America could hope for in the 1870s. Today, the story of the cattle drive lives on in unexpected ways. In major cities across America, Oakland, Philadelphia, New York, Los Angeles, riding clubs preserve black cowboy culture. The Oakland Black Cowboy Association, the Compton Cowboys, the Fletcher Street Urban Riding Club in Philadelphia. They're keeping alive a history that Hollywood tried to erase. Every year in Texas and Louisiana, African-American trail rides celebrate this heritage. The Prairie View Trail Ride Association has ridden from Hempstead to Houston every year since 1957. Museums like the National Multicultural Western Heritage Museum in Fort Worth tell the stories that were left out of the history books. Because the real story of the American cowboy isn't white. It's not even one color. It's black, white, Mexican, Native American. It's teenage boys and hardened men. It's swagger and fear, courage and desperation, skill and luck. The cattle drive lasted only 20 years, but it created something that transcended those 2 decades. It created an image of what it meant to be independent, self-reliant, courageous in the face of nature's fury, loyal to your crew, skilled at your craft. Those values weren't unique to one race. They were forged by everyone who rode the trail. The boots, the spurs, the bandanas, the songs in the darkness. They weren't costumes. They were the tools of men doing the hardest job in America for the lowest pay, in the most dangerous conditions, with the least recognition. And when you see a cowboy boot today, remember, it was designed by people who needed it to survive. When you hear a Western song, remember, it was sung to keep cattle calm and cowboys alive. When you think of the cowboy spirit, remember, 1 in 4 of them was black. That's the real story of the cattle drive, not the mythology, not the Hollywood version, the truth.